In a world where love is often seen as the ultimate goal, what happens when a new bride discovers the truth about her marriage only 24 hours after saying "I do"? Betrayal, lies, and a violent confrontation await, leaving one woman to fight not only for her freedom, but for her very identity. What happens when the truth is more shocking than she could have ever imagined? This is a story of survival, strength, and a woman's journey to reclaim her life. Sarah had always dreamed of her wedding day. As a young woman from a traditional Muslim family in Malaysia, her life had been shaped by values of respect, family, and modesty. She had been raised with the belief that marriage was sacred, a bond between two people meant to last a lifetime. Her parents, especially her mother, had instilled in her the idea that her wedding would be the most important day of her life, one that would mark the beginning of a new chapter filled with love and happiness. It was a vision she had held on to since childhood, and now, that dream was about to become a reality. The wedding preparations had been extensive, as was customary in her village. Everything had to be perfect. From the delicate decorations to the elaborate traditional attire, every detail had been planned with care. Sarah's dress was a beautiful blend of white and gold, with intricate embroidery that made her feel like a princess. Her family had spared no expense, ensuring that everything would go according to plan. It was a grand celebration, not just of Sarah's union with her groom Zaid, but also a reflection of the love and respect the two families shared. Zaid was a well-respected young man from a prominent family. He had been everything Sarah's parents could have hoped for in a husband: educated, well-mannered, and financially stable. He was a successful businessman, charming, and appeared to be everything Sarah had ever wanted in a partner. The two families had known each other for years, and Sarah's parents had approved of the match long before the proposal was made. There was a sense of security and excitement that surrounded their engagement. Sarah's friends and relatives all praised Zaid, talking about how lucky she was to have found someone so admirable. He was handsome, successful, and had a reputation for being kind and generous. On the morning of the wedding, Sarah was filled with anticipation. As she got ready, she couldn't help but smile at the thought of her new life. She had spent weeks imagining what her life with Zaid would be like. They would move into a beautiful home, have children, and grow old together. The future seemed bright, and the thought of being his wife filled her with joy. The ceremony itself was a blur of happiness. The traditional rituals, the exchange of vows, and the prayers felt surreal. Sarah's heart raced as she walked down the aisle, her hand in her father's, and Zaid stood at the altar, waiting for her. His smile was warm, and his eyes sparkled with excitement. Everything felt like it was falling into place perfectly. The crowd cheered, the music played, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was watching them, celebrating their love. Once the ceremony was over, the newlyweds were whisked away to a private room. This was supposed to be the beginning of their life together, and Sarah was eager to start this new chapter. However, as soon as the door closed behind them, an unexpected tension filled the room. Zaid's demeanor shifted subtly, and Sarah, still on cloud nine from the wedding, didn't initially notice the change. For the first few minutes, they spoke about their excitement for the future, but the conversation quickly turned to a more serious tone. Zaid began to act distant, and the warm energy of the day seemed to evaporate. Sarah attributed it to the exhaustion of the day's events, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had spent so much time preparing for the perfect wedding, and now, in the quiet of their new home, she couldn't understand why Zaid was acting so strangely. He was no longer the charming man she had married earlier in the day. The first signs of discomfort came when Zaid, who had been affectionate and loving throughout their engagement, suddenly became cold. He avoided eye contact and responded with short, clipped answers. Sarah tried to engage him in conversation, asking about their plans for the evening, but he seemed distracted. There was an unease in the air that Sarah couldn't quite place, but she brushed it off, thinking that it was simply the weight of the day's events catching up with him. Later, Zaid became more distant, retreating into silence. He told Sarah that he needed some time to relax and that he wanted to be left alone for a while. Sarah, trying to be understanding, agreed to give him space. But as the evening wore on, her discomfort grew. The excitement that had once filled her heart now seemed to dissipate, replaced by an unsettling feeling that something was off. The image of the loving husband she had imagined during their engagement seemed to be fading, and in its place, she was left with a cold, unapproachable man who barely spoke to her. As the night progressed, Sarah's unease grew. Zaid was becoming increasingly withdrawn, and she couldn't understand why. He no longer smiled at her, nor did he offer any comforting words. The warmth of the day was replaced by a chilling silence. Sarah tried to get him to open up, but he remained distant, retreating further into himself. She wondered if he was just tired or overwhelmed by the wedding. She wanted to believe that this behavior was just temporary, a result of the whirlwind of the day's events. But what happened next shocked Sarah to her core. When she tried to approach him, hoping for a tender moment to reassure her, Zaid suddenly snapped. Without warning, he turned on her, his face contorted with anger. His words were harsh, and his tone was accusatory. Sarah stood there, speechless, as Zaid raged at her, his anger directed at something she couldn't comprehend. He spoke of betrayal, of lies, and of trust. It was as if the man she had married just hours ago was now someone else entirely. Confused and terrified, Sarah took a step back. She didn't know what was happening, but she instinctively knew that this was no ordinary disagreement. This was something much darker, something she was unprepared for. The man who had promised to cherish and protect her was now turning against her. She had no idea what had triggered this outburst, but she could feel the fear rising within her. For the rest of the night, Sarah was left in the silence of her thoughts, wondering what had gone wrong. The wedding had been everything she had dreamed of, but now it seemed like a distant memory, a cruel joke. Her new life was turning into a nightmare, and she didn't know how to wake up from it. Every minute felt like an eternity, and as she lay in bed that night, her heart pounded in her chest. The woman she had once been, filled with hope and excitement, was now replaced by a girl who was trapped, afraid, and unsure of what the future would hold. Little did she know, the nightmare was only beginning. The days following the wedding were a blur of confusion and fear. Sarah woke up the morning after her wedding, still grappling with the events of the previous night. The joy and excitement she had felt just hours ago had all but vanished. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, she sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of what had happened. Zaid had been a completely different person since their wedding night. Cold, distant, and unpredictable. The man she had married, the man she had trusted and admired, was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a stranger sitting in the space where her husband should have been. As Sarah got dressed and prepared for the day, her mind raced. She tried to recall every conversation they had during their courtship, trying to piece together any clues that might explain Zaid's sudden shift in behavior. She remembered how charming he had been, how kind and patient he seemed, He had spoken of love, family, and a future together, painting a picture of a perfect life that seemed too good to be true. Now, that image was shattered, and Sarah was left to pick up the pieces. She had tried to reach out to him the night before, asking him if he was okay, if something was bothering him. But every time she attempted to connect, he pushed her away. His responses were short. His body language closed off. He kept talking about needing space, about feeling overwhelmed, but none of it made sense. The man she had married was not the same man who stood in front of her now. It was as if Zaid had hidden behind a mask for months, only to reveal his true nature once the wedding was over. The warm and loving fiancé she had known was replaced with someone unrecognizable, someone who didn't seem to care about her at all. That morning, when Sarah tried to speak to him over breakfast, Zaid barely acknowledged her presence. He sat at the table, his eyes glued to his phone, his face devoid of expression. Sarah, hoping for a change in mood, asked him about their plans for the day. She wanted to make him feel at ease, to break the silence that had grown between them. But Zaid barely looked up from his screen. His response was curt and dismissive. It felt as though she were speaking to a stranger, not the man she had pledged to spend her life with. The feeling of isolation settled over Sarah like a heavy weight. She was now living with a man who barely spoke to her, who seemed indifferent to her presence. She couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of test, if this coldness was part of a larger plan, or if she had somehow done something wrong. She tried to convince herself that everything would be fine, that Zaid was just adjusting to the pressure of married life. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. There was a growing sense of dread in her stomach that she couldn't shake. As the hours passed, the tension between them only deepened. Every word she spoke felt like it was met with resistance. She could feel the walls closing in, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break through. Zaid's behavior was becoming more erratic, and the flashes of anger that had surfaced the night before were beginning to resurface. The more Sarah tried to communicate with him, the more he shut her out. He was increasingly irritable, his patience growing thinner by the minute. By late afternoon, Sarah could no longer ignore the dread that had been building inside her. The sudden shift in Zaid's behavior was too significant to be overlooked. Her heart raced as she tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Was this normal? Was this just the stress of marriage? Or was there something more sinister at play? She had never experienced anything like this before, and the fear that had been simmering inside her now threatened to overwhelm her. That evening, things took an even darker turn. Zaid's temper, which had been bubbling beneath the surface, finally exploded. He snapped at Sarah for the slightest thing, a misplaced plate, a comment she made about the dinner, a question about their plans for the future. Each time she tried to engage with him, Zaid became more hostile, his words sharp and laced with anger. He accused her of being careless, of not understanding his needs, of failing to be the wife he had expected. The accusations made no sense to Sarah. She hadn't done anything wrong. Yet Zaid's anger was undeniable, and she found herself shrinking under his glare. His words were cutting, and each one pierced through Sarah's heart like a knife. She had never seen this side of him before. The man she had fallen in love with, the man who had promised to cherish and protect her, was now lashing out at her for reasons she couldn't comprehend. The warmth and affection he had once shown her seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a harsh and critical demeanor. The confusion in Sarah's mind deepened. What had changed? Why was he treating her this way? Had the wedding ceremony, the vows, meant nothing to him? Or was this some kind of twisted test she had failed? The verbal outburst quickly escalated into physical aggression. Zaid grabbed her arm roughly, his grip so tight that Sarah felt her skin burn under his fingers. It wasn't the first time he had touched her this way, but it was the first time she had felt truly afraid. The force of his grip sent a jolt of panic through her. She wanted to pull away, to scream, but something held her back. She feared that any resistance might provoke him further. Zaid's face was contorted with rage, and for the first time, Sarah saw a side of him that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. As the evening wore on, Zaid's anger continued to fester. The tension in the room became unbearable, and Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of escape. She knew she couldn't stay in this toxic environment any longer. But where could she go? What could she do? Her entire world had been turned upside down in just a matter of hours. The man she had trusted, the man she had married, was no longer the person she had known. She was now living with a stranger, someone who had shown his true colors only after the wedding was over. The reality of her situation began to sink in, and the fear that had been building inside her erupted into a quiet panic. How had this happened? What had she gotten herself into? Sarah didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Her marriage was not the life she had imagined. It was a nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from. And as she lay in bed that night, her heart heavy with fear, she realized that the dream she had once held so dear had turned into a terrifying reality. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. Her life had just taken a dark, unexpected turn. Days passed in a haze of confusion and fear. Each morning Sarah woke up, her body tense, her mind racing. The silence between her and Zaid had become deafening. What had happened to the man she had married? The man who had once been gentle, kind, and seemingly perfect for her. Sarah couldn't understand how everything had changed so suddenly, so dramatically. The man she had once trusted and admired was now a stranger, a cold, distant, and unpredictable stranger. The worst part was that she couldn't figure out what had triggered this transformation. Each day seemed to follow a pattern. Zaid would wake up with little acknowledgement of her presence. His eyes were distant, his movements mechanical. He spent most of his time in his study, working on his business, rarely engaging with her or showing any interest in her at all. Sarah had tried to reach out, asking how he was, asking if something was wrong, but he remained distant, answering her in monosyllables, as if speaking to her was a chore. She began to feel like a ghost in her own home. She had no choice but to keep quiet, trying her best not to provoke him. Zaid's mood swings were becoming more erratic, and she never knew when his temper would flare up. One moment, he would be quietly absorbed in his work, and the next, he would snap over something insignificant. It was as though he was constantly on edge, like a ticking time bomb, and Sarah was walking on eggshells, afraid to do anything that might set him off. Every little gesture, every word, felt like it might be the trigger. The worst part was that she couldn't figure out what she had done to deserve this treatment. She had been nothing but patient, understanding, and supportive, but nothing seemed to matter. Zaid's bursts of anger had become more frequent. One afternoon, Sarah made the mistake of asking if he wanted to join her for lunch. She had hoped that maybe they could talk, reconnect in some way. But Zaid's response was harsh. He didn't want to be bothered. He had more important things to do, he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Sarah tried to explain that they needed to communicate, that a marriage required effort from both sides. But Zaid wasn't having it. His eyes flashed with irritation, and his tone turned menacing. "Stop acting like everything is fine," he snapped. "You think I'm going to sit around and play happy couple with you? You're wrong." Sarah had been taken aback by his words. They hurt more than she cared to admit. It wasn't just the cruelty of his tone that stung, but the coldness in his eyes. It was as if he had no care for her feelings, no empathy for the woman he had just promised to love and protect. The realization hit her like a punch in the stomach. Zaid didn't love her, not in the way she had believed. If he had ever loved her, it was gone now, replaced by something darker. Later that evening, Zaid returned home later than usual, his mood darker than ever. Sarah, still reeling from his earlier outburst, didn't know how to approach him. He entered the house without acknowledging her, and Sarah sat in the living room, her hands trembling as she watched him. She tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. She knew that whatever had been simmering inside him would inevitably come to a head. Without a word, Zaid headed straight to his study, slamming the door behind him. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. She sat there for hours, unable to sleep, waiting for the moment when Zaid would emerge from his room. But as the hours dragged on, she began to worry. What was going on with him? What was happening to her life? Was this really the man she had married? Was this really the future she had envisioned for herself? By midnight, Sarah couldn't stand the silence any longer. She needed answers. She needed to understand what had changed, why Zaid was treating her like this. With her heart pounding in her chest, she went to his study and knocked softly on the door. "Zaid," she called out, her voice shaking. "Please, can we talk?" There was a long pause, and Sarah's heart sank. She could hear Zaid moving around inside the room, but he didn't answer. She knocked again, louder this time, her voice pleading. "I just want to understand," she said, almost in a whisper. "Please, I don't know what's happening. I don't know why you're doing this." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened slightly, just enough for Zaid to peer out. His eyes were tired, bloodshot, and his expression was unreadable. He looked at her for a moment, as though weighing his options, before stepping back and allowing her to enter the room. The air inside the study was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She could feel the heaviness of his presence, the coldness radiating from him. "I told you to leave me alone," Zaid muttered, his voice low and strained. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice cracking with emotion. "We were happy. We were going to build a life together. What happened to that?" Zaid didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back on her, walking across the room and staring out of the window. His silence was deafening, and Sarah's heart sank further into despair. She had no idea what to say, how to make him open up, how to make him see her, the woman he had married, the woman who was still trying to understand him. Minutes passed in agonizing silence before Zaid finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake," he said. "Marrying you was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it." Sarah felt the ground slip out from under her. The words struck her like a slap to the face. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't process what he had just said. How could this be happening? How could he say something like that? Had he ever cared for her at all? "I thought I could live with it," Zaid continued, his back still turned. "But I can't. I can't be with you. Not like this." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the weight of his words crashed over her. She had never imagined this. She had never thought that the man she had trusted, the man she had pledged her life to, would turn on her so completely. He wasn't just angry with her, he was rejecting her entirely. She was nothing to him now, just a mistake, a choice he regretted. Without another word, Zaid walked away from her, leaving Sarah standing in the cold emptiness of the room. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the chair, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The dream of her perfect marriage, the dream of a happy future, had shattered in an instant. She was alone, more alone than she had ever been, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. Sarah found herself trapped in a world she didn't understand, caught in a situation she couldn't escape. Zaid had turned from the man she had once loved into a complete stranger, and the reality of her marriage was sinking in with every passing minute. His rejection was cold and final, and there was nothing Sarah could do to change his mind. No matter how many times she tried to talk to him, to understand what had gone wrong, Zaid remained distant, locked inside himself. His silence was deafening, and it was as if he had built a wall around himself that Sarah could not penetrate. Each morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of dread. She dreaded the cold silence that would greet her, the loneliness that would follow her throughout the day. She spent hours in the house, walking from room to room, unsure of what to do with herself. There was no longer any comfort in the space she once called home. The house, once filled with hope and excitement for the future, now felt suffocating, like a prison she couldn't escape from. Zaid's moods had become increasingly unpredictable. There were moments when he would completely ignore her, pretending she didn't exist. And then there were moments when his anger would flare up, and he would lash out for reasons that made no sense. Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, afraid to speak, afraid to make the wrong move. Every time she tried to reach out to him, every time she tried to make him see her, he pushed her further away. One evening, Sarah decided she could no longer live like this. She had to understand what had gone wrong. She had to know why Zaid had turned against her so completely, why he had rejected her so cruelly. She had to confront him, even if it meant facing the truth she was afraid to hear. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. This wasn't just about her marriage anymore. It was about her sanity, her well-being. That evening, she waited for Zaid to come home from work. He had been gone for hours, and Sarah was growing anxious. She had prepared herself for the confrontation, steeling herself against whatever he might say. She knew this would be difficult, but it was something she had to do. She couldn't live in the dark any longer, couldn't continue to exist in this limbo where she was neither wife nor stranger. She needed answers. When Zaid finally returned home, it was late, and the house was quiet. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to make his usual entrance. But when Zaid walked in, he didn't even look at her. He went straight to his study, closing the door behind him without a word. The silence between them was suffocating. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She had to talk to him, had to know what was happening. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stood up and walked to the study door. She knocked softly, her voice trembling as she called out to him. "Zaid," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please, we need to talk. I can't keep living like this." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might not respond at all. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open slightly, just enough for her to see a sliver of his face. Zaid's eyes were dark and empty, devoid of the warmth and affection that had once been there. His gaze was cold, distant, and it sent a chill through Sarah's body. "What do you want now?" Zaid asked, his voice flat, almost uninterested. "I just want to understand," Sarah replied, her heart in her throat. "I want to understand what happened. Why are you doing this? Why are you treating me like this?" Zaid didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, looking at her through the crack in the door. His expression was unreadable, and Sarah couldn't tell if he was angry, sad, or simply numb. It felt like he was a different person entirely. "You don't understand, do you?" Zaid finally spoke, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You'll never understand." Sarah's heart sank. "What do you mean? What did I do wrong? I don't understand. I don't know why you've changed." Zaid looked at her for a long time, as though debating whether or not he should even answer her question. The silence was unbearable. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to look away. She needed to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "I never wanted this," Zaid said finally, his voice low. "I never wanted to marry you. I didn't want any of this." The words hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She recoiled, her chest tightening as she tried to process what he had just said. How could he say that? How could he have gone through with the wedding if he had never wanted it? It didn't make sense. "But we were happy," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "You told me we had a future together." Zaid's expression twisted in a way Sarah couldn't quite understand, a mixture of frustration and anger. He stepped back from the door, crossing his arms as he turned away from her. "You were just a way out," he muttered bitterly, as if talking to himself. "I needed a way out of my own life, out of the expectations everyone placed on me. My family, the community, they all wanted me to settle down, to get married. So I did it. I did what they wanted. But I never wanted you. I never wanted any of this." The words were like daggers, cutting deep into Sarah's heart. She could hardly breathe as the reality of what Zaid was saying sank in. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his plan, a tool to escape the pressures of his life. Their marriage had never been about love, never been about building a future together. It had all been a lie. "You used me?" Sarah choked out, the tears welling up in her eyes. "You lied to me?" Zaid didn't answer. He simply turned his back to her, his shoulders tense as though he couldn't bear to face her anymore. The silence in the room was suffocating, but Sarah didn't know how to break it. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone she didn't even recognize. "I never wanted this," Zaid repeated, almost as if trying to convince himself. "You were just convenient. You fit the role I needed you to. But now it's over." The weight of his words hit her with full force. The dream she had held onto for so long, the dream of a life built on love and trust, was shattered in an instant. There was no future for them. There never had been. She had been living in a fantasy, clinging to an illusion that had never been real. Sarah stood there, numb, her heart broken beyond repair. She couldn't bring herself to say anything more. There was nothing left to say. Zaid had made it clear that their marriage meant nothing to him, that she meant nothing to him. She turned away from the door, her legs weak, and walked slowly back to the living room, where she collapsed onto the couch, her mind spinning with disbelief. Her life had been turned upside down. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. The dream of a future with him was over, and Sarah was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered heart, alone and broken, in a life she didn't recognize anymore. The days after the confrontation felt like a long, endless spiral of confusion and heartbreak. Sarah had never imagined her life would come to this, not in a million years. The marriage she had dreamed of, the future she had envisioned, had evaporated like smoke in the wind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear Zaid's cold, dismissive words echoing in her mind. "You were just convenient. You fit the role I needed you to." It was like a mantra she couldn't shake off. It played over and over like a broken record, each time more painful than the last. She spent the next few days in a daze. The house, that had once felt like a home, now felt like a tomb, empty and lifeless. She wandered aimlessly from room to room, unable to settle, unable to find comfort in anything. Her belongings, once arranged with such care, now felt foreign to her. Every corner of the house reminded her of Zaid, of the life she had imagined they would build together, now reduced to nothing. She couldn't escape the memories. She couldn't escape the man who had once promised to love her forever. Zaid's presence, or rather his absence, was unbearable. He was no longer coming home at the usual times. He had stopped sharing meals with her altogether, retreating to his study, locking himself away. Sarah tried to reach out to him, tried to break through the wall he had erected around himself, but every attempt was met with cold indifference. He barely acknowledged her existence. His silence was a punishment in itself, and Sarah couldn't understand why he was so determined to hurt her. She had tried to be a good wife, tried to understand his needs, his desires, but all of it seemed meaningless now. Nothing mattered. The isolation she felt was consuming. It wasn't just the silence in the house. It was the loneliness that gnawed at her from the inside. Sarah had no friends here. Her family was miles away, and she had never really gotten to know the people in the community. She had invested all her time and energy into her marriage, into Zaid, believing that love would be enough to sustain her. But now she realized how naive she had been. Love wasn't enough when the other person didn't feel the same way. Love wasn't enough when one person was living in a different reality, one where the relationship was nothing more than an obligation to fulfill. Sarah began to feel as if she were fading, like a shadow in her own life. There was no joy, no hope. Each day bled into the next, and she was unsure of how much longer she could bear it. Her reflection in the mirror was a reminder of everything she had lost, of who she used to be before Zaid had torn her world apart. The woman who had once been full of dreams, who had looked forward to the future with hope, was gone, replaced by someone who felt empty, defeated. It was as though Zaid had taken everything from her, her trust, her self-worth, her sense of security, and left her with nothing but the wreckage of her own broken heart. One evening, after another long day of wandering the house in a fog, Sarah decided she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep waiting for a man who had made it clear that he didn't want her. She couldn't keep subjecting herself to the pain, the confusion, the isolation. She had to leave, had to get away from Zaid, from the life that had been stolen from her. She needed to find herself again, to rebuild the parts of her that had been shattered in the wake of his betrayal. But leaving wasn't as easy as it seemed. The thought of leaving the house, of leaving everything behind, felt like an insurmountable challenge. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no answers, only questions. Her family had always been distant, and though she could turn to them, she knew it would be hard for them to understand the pain she was going through. They had never met Zaid, had never seen the side of him she now knew all too well. To them, he was still the perfect man, the one who had charmed them all. During their brief visits, the man who had promised to take care of their daughter, to love her forever. But forever had come to an end. It had ended the moment Zaid had decided she was nothing more than a tool to escape the pressures of his life. It had ended when he rejected her, when he made it clear that she didn't matter to him, that their marriage meant nothing. Now all Sarah could see was the lie she had been living. The facade that had once seemed so perfect had crumbled to dust, and all she had left was the painful truth. Her mind raced as she sat in the living room, staring at the walls, lost in her thoughts. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, couldn't keep pretending that Zaid was the man she had married. She needed to take control of her life again. She needed to find a way out. As she sat there, her phone rang, breaking the silence. Sarah picked it up hesitantly, unsure of who could be calling her at this hour. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something urged her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, before a voice she hadn't heard in a long time responded. "Sarah?" The voice was gentle, familiar. It was her mother. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she heard her mother's voice. She hadn't spoken to her parents in weeks, hadn't even thought about reaching out. She had been too consumed by the mess of her marriage to realize how much she needed them. Her mother's voice was a lifeline, a reminder of a time when things had been simpler, when love had felt safe, secure. "Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I feel so lost." Her mother's voice softened. "Sweetheart, it's okay. You don't have to go through this alone. Whatever you need, we're here for you. You don't have to stay in that situation if it's hurting you. You deserve better." Sarah felt the tears fall freely now, the weight of her pain finally coming to the surface. She had kept it all bottled up inside for so long, trying to make things work, trying to hold on to the dream that had once seemed so real. But now she was ready to face the truth. She was ready to stop pretending. "Thank you, Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what's next, but I can't stay here. I can't stay with him." Her mother's voice was full of compassion. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. You don't have to face this alone." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. Maybe she could rebuild her life piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. She had a family who loved her, who would help her find her way. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She was just starting over. The following weeks felt like a blur of decisions, emotions, and struggles. Sarah had made the choice to leave, but the reality of it was far more complex than she had imagined. There were moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was doing the right thing, moments when the weight of her own decision felt unbearable. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that staying in the toxic environment with Zaid was not an option. The quiet violence of his emotional rejection, the cruelty in his words, had left deep scars. It was no longer a life she could live. Her mother had insisted that she come back home, to be with her family where she could find comfort, support, and understanding. Sarah hadn't been sure at first. She had always felt like an adult, like she could manage her own life, but now, as she packed her things, she realized that she wasn't as strong as she had once believed. The reality of her marriage's collapse had shaken her to the core, and she needed her family more than ever. They didn't judge her. They didn't question her decisions. They simply offered her a safe space to heal. Sarah's departure from Zaid's house was quiet. There were no confrontations, no final words exchanged. Zaid didn't even seem to notice that she was leaving. He was so consumed with his own life, his own confusion, that he couldn't even muster the energy to care. The lack of a confrontation left Sarah with a sense of emptiness. She hadn't wanted to leave on bad terms, but now it seemed like their marriage had never been anything more than a convenient arrangement for him. She had nothing left to say to him, and in a way, she realized that he had already checked out long before she had. The journey to her parents' house was quiet and reflective. The long drive allowed Sarah the time she needed to process everything she had been through. She thought about the man she had once thought she would grow old with, the man who had been so kind and loving when they first met. But now, that image felt like a distant memory, something she had created in her mind to cope with the reality. Zaid was a stranger now, someone she no longer recognized, someone whose words and actions had torn apart the illusion of their life together. There was no going back. When Sarah finally arrived at her parents' house, it was late in the evening. Her mother greeted her with open arms, wrapping her in a warm embrace. The comfort of her mother's presence was overwhelming, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. There was no judgment, no harsh words, just understanding. Her mother made her a cup of tea and sat with her in the living room, letting Sarah talk when she was ready. She didn't push her to relive the painful details, but Sarah found herself sharing everything. The lies, the betrayal, the heartbreak. It all came pouring out in a flood of emotions. Her mother listened patiently, offering soft words of comfort. "You're strong, sweetheart," she said gently. "You've been through so much, but this is not the end of your story. It's just a chapter, and there are many more to come. You will heal, and you will find happiness again." The warmth of her mother's love was like a balm on Sarah's wounded soul. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt hope stir within her. Maybe it would take time, maybe it would take a lot of effort, but she could rebuild. She could start over. She wasn't the broken woman she had been just days before. She was learning to see her own strength, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The next few days were a mix of relief and discomfort. Sarah was back in the familiar surroundings of her childhood home, but everything felt different now. The person she had been, before the marriage, before Zaid, was still there, but she had changed in ways she couldn't entirely explain. She wasn't the same woman who had walked down the aisle, filled with dreams and expectations. Now she was someone else. Someone who had been through an emotional war and had come out the other side battered but not broken. But who was she now? What would she do next? Sarah spent the next few days unpacking her things and trying to adjust to her new life. She wasn't sure what came next. The future was uncertain, and the thought of starting over was both exciting and terrifying. She had always dreamed of a family, of building a life with someone who loved her. But now that dream felt so distant, like something she had never really known. Would she ever trust anyone again? Would she ever be able to love someone with the same openness she had once offered Zaid? The questions swirled in her mind, but she couldn't find any answers. The first few weeks at her parents' house were quiet. Her mother kept her company, offering gentle encouragement and support. Sarah began to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She reconnected with old friends, people she had once lost touch with when her life had become consumed by her marriage. The familiar faces and conversations reminded her that life could still be good, that she didn't have to let Zaid define her. She was still capable of finding happiness, of building meaningful relationships. But even as she tried to move forward, Zaid's shadow loomed over her. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the lies he had told, the hurt he had caused. It was as if he had taken a part of her with him when he let her go, a piece of her that she wasn't sure she could ever get back. But then, as the days passed, Sarah began to realize something important. She didn't need Zaid to be whole. She didn't need anyone to complete her. She was enough on her own. A few weeks later, Sarah made the decision to start therapy. It had been suggested by her mother, who had noticed how deeply Sarah was struggling to heal from the emotional wounds of the past. At first, Sarah was hesitant. She had always prided herself on being strong, on handling things on her own. But she realized that sometimes asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. She needed to confront the trauma, the heartbreak, and begin the process of healing. And that meant accepting that she couldn't do it alone. Therapy was difficult at first. It was hard to open up, to put into words the pain she had felt, the feelings of betrayal and the doubts that had plagued her. But as time passed, Sarah began to feel a sense of relief. She was able to talk about Zaid, about their marriage, without feeling overwhelmed by emotion. She was able to untangle the web of confusion in her mind and see things more clearly. Slowly but surely, she was beginning to understand that she wasn't defined by her past. She was more than the woman who had been left behind by her husband. She was someone capable of growth, capable of overcoming the challenges life threw at her. As Sarah continued her therapy sessions, she began to rediscover parts of herself she had forgotten. She started to explore her own interests again, things she had set aside during her marriage. She picked up hobbies she had once loved, things that made her feel alive, things that reminded her of who she was before she had lost herself in a toxic relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were days when she felt overwhelmed, days when the weight of her past seemed too heavy to bear. But each day, she grew stronger. Each day, she learned to let go of the hurt, to release the anger, and to forgive herself for everything she had allowed herself to endure. And in that process, Sarah realized that life didn't have to be defined by the past. The future was still hers to shape. And she would shape it, not as the broken woman she had been, but as the woman who had survived, who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet again, and who was determined to find happiness, no matter how long it took. As the months went by, Sarah found herself slowly carving out a new life for herself. The journey wasn't linear, nor was it easy, but each step forward felt like a victory, no matter how small. The emotional scars from her marriage to Zaid were still there, but they were no longer the focal point of her existence. Slowly, she began to recognize the strength she had within herself. Something she hadn't known was there before. The woman she had become in the aftermath of the pain was one that surprised her. She had discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed, and each day brought with it the possibility of something new. She had started working again, finding a job that allowed her to express herself creatively. It was a field she had always been passionate about, but one she had pushed aside when her marriage had consumed her. But now, Sarah was determined to live life on her own terms, to follow her own dreams, regardless of the past. She threw herself into her work, enjoying the sense of purpose it brought her. There were days when she doubted herself, when the weight of her past threatened to pull her under. But those moments were becoming fewer. The woman who had once believed she was defined by her relationship was starting to see that she was so much more than that. As she became more comfortable in her new routine, Sarah also began to reconnect with her social life. She reached out to old friends and began to make new ones. It wasn't always easy to break down the walls she had built around herself, but each new connection brought a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in years. She was learning to trust again, not just others, but herself. And with that trust came the freedom to be vulnerable, to share her story without fear of judgment. She was learning that she didn't need to hide the parts of herself that had been hurt. Those parts were just as much a part of her as the strong, independent woman she was becoming. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter from Zaid. It arrived unexpectedly, sent to her parents' address. The letter was short, almost cold, but it carried a weight that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Zaid apologized for what he had done, for the hurt he had caused, and for the way their marriage had ended. He claimed to have realized the mistakes he had made, but there was a sense of detachment in his words. It was as though the apology was more for his own peace of mind than for hers. Sarah stared at the letter for a long time, her hands trembling slightly as she read through the words again. There was no closure in the letter, no indication that he truly understood the depth of the pain he had caused. But Sarah had learned not to expect closure from him. In the end, his apology didn't matter anymore. It was a hollow gesture, one that was too late to undo the damage. For a moment she considered responding, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She didn't need his validation anymore. The closure she sought wasn't going to come from him. It had to come from within herself. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, a symbolic act of letting go. It no longer had a hold on her. The past had its place, but it didn't define her. It was a chapter in her story, but it wasn't the entire book. That night, Sarah sat quietly on the couch, reflecting on how far she had come. She thought about the woman she had been when she first married Zaid. the girl who had thought love was enough, who had believed that marriage was the answer to all of her problems. She realized how much she had grown since then, how much stronger she was. She had faced the pain, the confusion, the loneliness, and had emerged from it not unscathed, but transformed. She wasn't perfect. She didn't have all the answers. But she knew one thing for certain. She was enough. The following weeks were filled with even more growth and discovery. Sarah had started volunteering at a local charity, helping those who were going through difficult times, people who had experienced trauma, betrayal, and loss. It was an unexpected but powerful way to connect with others. Through her own experiences, she had developed an empathy that allowed her to understand the pain of others in a deep and meaningful way. It wasn't about pity. It was about shared human experience, about finding healing in each other's company. One evening, after another fulfilling day of volunteering, Sarah found herself sitting at the kitchen table with her mother, having a quiet dinner. There was a sense of peace in the room, a tranquility that hadn't been present in their home for a long time. Her mother looked at her with soft eyes, as if she were seeing her daughter for the first time in a while. Sarah realized that she had changed not just on the outside, but on the inside as well. She had found her way back to herself, and in doing so had found the strength to rebuild not just her own life, but the relationships that mattered most. "Mom," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd be here, you know. I never thought I'd be this person. I thought I'd always be stuck in that marriage, in that life." Her mother smiled gently. "You've always been strong, sweetheart. You just needed to see it for yourself." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But these were not tears of sadness. These were tears of gratitude. She had come so far, and in doing so, she had discovered parts of herself that had been buried for so long. She had learned to love herself again, to forgive herself for the choices she had made, and to accept that the past, though painful, had shaped her into the person she was meant to become. "I feel like I'm finally living again," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't need anyone to complete me. I'm complete on my own." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You always were, sweetheart. You just had to remember." As Sarah looked around the room, her heart felt full. She had no idea what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was no longer held captive by the past. She was free. Free to explore the world, free to follow her dreams, free to make mistakes and learn from them. The journey she had been on had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. It had taught her more about herself than she had ever thought possible. And she was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she was no longer defined by the scars of her past, but by the woman she had become in spite of them. As Sarah sat in the quiet of the evening, she felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. She was ready to embrace her future, whatever it might bring, and to live it with the strength, resilience, and grace that she had discovered within herself. The past was no longer a weight she carried. It was simply a chapter in the story of her life, one that had made her who she was today. And today, She was more than enough.